welcome. We have the Articles versus the Constitution. We're going to look at continuity and change. Let's get started. Here's that list of skills again from College Board. Today we're going to embrace the hardest of those, continuity and change. So let's see if we can see some similarities or consistencies within the American political tradition, back from its colonial beginnings throughout the consolidation of power into the Constitution. The underlying question is who's in charge. We talked about colonial autonomy for quite some time, a period of salutary neglect in which political institutions and economic power actually developed in the colonies. Later, that's going to be checked by the British as they change their colonial policy after 1763, of course. And there's also a concern about the individuality of the colonies, and there's some sort of young or early examples of unity, as we see with the Join or Die cartoon at the Albany Congress, and the reaction to the Stamp Act as well. But keep in mind that we don't even really have a national government when we declare independence. We have a Second Continental Congress, but there's really no national authority to enforce or coerce, and that certainly carries on into the Articles. Here they are, the Continental Congress. The underlying themes we should think about would be the transfer of sovereignty, the consolidation of power, and then the expansion of that political power. So the transfer of sovereignty from the British to the colonies, from the states consolidated to a central government. However weak the Articles were, it was a national government. And then obviously with the ratification of the Constitution, we see great expansion of political power, both in terms of creating an executive, and then later the Supreme Court asserting its role with judicial review. And there's Alexander Hamilton, the most well-known Federalist, right? The person who is certainly in favor of the Constitution, but in this sense of the word Federalist, I mean the political party that emerges beginning in the 1790s. Now, the Articles, I said in class, are a government of necessity and a government of the times. We need a unified national front. We are at war, and it certainly would help in terms of foreign relations to have some sort of cohesion there. But the government itself reflects the times. And so you got to think about what's trending in American political thought when the Articles were ratified in 1781. And we should also think about how, or to what degree, there were changes in that by the time it was replaced by the Constitution in 1789. We are stating to the world that we are justified in independence from Great Britain because of tyranny and the king's neglect and Parliament's neglect of colonial interest. This idea of taxation without representation is a very politicized statement. And so, of course, we fear large government, and the Articles reflect that. As I said, we need a collective voice. We need to be able to take an authoritative position, and we have to somehow be able to maintain order. And so having a national government can help with all of those. As many students said on their essays, the Articles can be seen as a pathway or a stepping stone for the new nation. There are, in fact, 14 governments under the Articles. Because the national government's so weak, you could say that it's actually, it's, I guess, slightly superior to the state governments, but really it isn't, because the state governments retain a tremendous amount of sovereignty. As I said before, with the sort of what's trending, the idea that the government should be intentionally weak because states should be sovereign, local rule, this idea of political autonomy in a small-scale republic, that was sort of seen as the ideal way to carry forward. And you can see that with no executive, no judicial branch, no power to tax, no power to control interstate commerce, all of which we could say were deficiencies under the Articles of Confederation because it prevented sort of national growth. You could say it fostered state growth, which I think is probably what the Articles were designed with in mind. We need a supermajority to pass laws and unanimous support to make major changes. Of course, they just circumvent that at the Constitutional Convention. So what sparked the change? Well, the easy answer is Shays' Rebellion. I've heard that a few times. I'm sure you have as well. I'm not buying that that's the only reason why, and I think that it's probably much more complicated than that. I know that once the Constitution is ratified, there are several people who sought to expand the government, the power of the government, very quickly. Alexander Hamilton is a prime example of that. We've already seen his picture. There's Shays. How about John Marshall, the person who is not the first Supreme Court Chief Justice, but certainly the man who is responsible for establishing judicial review and greatly expanding the role of the Supreme Court. George Washington also was a nationalist. He was not a Federalist in terms of being a member of the party, but he certainly listened to Alexander Hamilton frequently, who was, of course, his Secretary of Treasury. John Adams, who follows George Washington, is a party line Federalist, I suppose, and even Jefferson, who of course is a Democratic Republican, but once he becomes president, acts much more like the Federalists. It doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that the president can buy Louisiana, but he did that. That's that idea of a loose interpretation of the Constitution that the Federalists were very vocal about. So again, sort of like the idea of the ideals that we have for politics, and then like the practical application of those ideals. And you could say Jefferson changed his whole ideology because of the nature of the job. There's Louisiana. You want to give it back? I don't. It's worth saying here that the Constitution is rooted in compromise, and that does somewhat expose differences of opinion. The Great Compromise, for example, settled the conflict of representation in Congress. Obviously, small states wanted a continuation of the one state, one vote system that existed under the Articles, and large states wanted to see population define that. And so, thanks to Roger Sherman from Connecticut, we get this compromise with a bicameral legislative branch. And of course, that in itself also exposes the concern of how do we count the population towards a representation. If the South contains a number of slaves, they would have an unfair level of representation. And so the Three-Fifths Compromise solved that, where 60% of slaves are counted towards population. We also have a president, not a monarch, but a president that is elected by the people. Sort of. And they're elected by the Electoral College, obviously, and this was sort of another way to protect against tyranny from below. The idea that the people would be driven by emotion and form factions and elect somebody who's not really fit to rule. That would never happen. The Constitution basically addresses all the major deficiencies under the Articles of Confederation. Those deficiencies can be defined as sort of obstacles towards national growth or national cohesion. Now, once the Constitution is ratified, the nation will soon be steered in a new direction, and this is largely due to Hamilton's financial plan. As Secretary of Treasury, of course, he had great influence on the direction of the nation, and so his suggestion to assume the federal debt and state debts, to use tariffs and excise taxes, and of course create a Bank of the United States, is sort of creating a national economic power, and that interest will protect young industry. Manufacturing in the United States is probably just beginning, really, on a national scale. And now tariffs, for example, will protect those products, whereas farmers in the West are kind of being penalized. At least they're not being assisted. That reflects the sort of divide between the East and the Eastern established interest of commerce, of manufacturing, as I said, and the more agrarian frontier folk who seem to have a growing distinct interest, and that can be seen with events such as Shays' Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion, as we discussed earlier. We also have a legitimate third branch of government. I think I've said that. The Supreme Court will establish judicial review under John Marshall, and thereby sort of make sure that the laws created by the legislative branch of government are constitutional, that they're carried out by the executive in a constitutional manner. So an obvious example of change is that the national government comes to steer this ship, as opposed to states, as we saw under the Articles. And again, the Constitution, once it's ratified, we start to see the phrase "these United States" being replaced with "the United States." And I often ask students, if you were to travel abroad, would you introduce yourself as an American or as the resident of your state? I'm from Connecticut. Probably not going to do that. In fact, many students tell me that when they do travel abroad, people have no idea where Connecticut is. And so, again, this is an example of change under the Constitution. The Civil War will be, to a large extent, the state's last collective attempt at asserting their individual sovereignty, the idea of states' rights. And we'll see folks like John C. Calhoun talking of nullification in the 1830s, sort of that a state can nullify a law that it deems to be unconstitutional. Very similar to the argument that we had with the Virginia and Kentucky resolves following the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, sort of that there is no power for the federal government to restrict the rights of newcomers to the country. It's not listed in the Constitution, therefore, it's unconstitutional. Furthermore, the Virginia resolves would say that the federal government is actually supposed to protect against free speech and freedom of press, and therefore it can't restrict that with laws like the Sedition Act. So, clearly the national government is in charge, but this idea of states asserting their sovereignty, of checking, what they deem to be or perceive to be tyrannical government, has not gone away. Another bit of significance that is largely continual is this transfer of sovereignty being peaceful. Obviously, the creation of the United States and then the assertion of the United States authority over the states involves, violent confrontation on sort of the bookends. The American War for Independence and the Civil War both involved fighting. We know that. But throughout that time, there are major changes in the American political system that are done peacefully. A great example is the Revolution of 1800. Obviously, our forefathers did not foresee the emergence of political parties, but they did emerge. And after John Adams is not reelected in 1800, we see one political party, the Federalists, go away, and they're replaced by the Democratic Republicans, the party of Jefferson. And that revolution, if you will, involves no bloodshed. So that's worth pointing out. Most characteristics of the American political heritage and tradition endure throughout this entire period and to the present day. Some other basic examples of heritage that continues representative government can be seen in the House of Burgesses back in the Virginia colony in 1619, all throughout the Continental Congresses, etc., and to the present day. Government by consent, the sort of charter of compact approach. We see that with the Mayflower Compact. We see that through the enlightened ideas of common sense and the Declaration of Independence, which suggests that we actually are justified in splitting from Britain because the charter of compact has been violated. Another example of American political heritage would be our protections against tyranny, sort of our emphasis on local autonomy and home rule. Again, the cry of no taxation without representation, politicized, an economic concern. And I already spoke of the separation of powers, thanks to Montesquieu in his writing, and the Electoral College, again, sort of protecting against the government itself and protecting against the fear of mob rule or the sort of too much democracy. I would encourage you to consider this brief list when thinking about continuity and change in the American political tradition. One last plea for the Articles of Confederation. We talk about the true success, or the biggest success, being the Land Ordinance of 85 and the Northwest Ordinance of 87. And in many ways, that shows continuity, but it also shows sort of the direction the country's moving. No American colonies. New states will be equal to existing states. Freedom of religion. That idea had been around for quite some time, and it's carried forward. Emphasis on education carried forward. But as you can see, there is a push to end slavery in the Northwest Territory. In fact, it's made illegal in those new states in that region. Obviously, that institution will be something that tears the country apart not long after this. The articles extended public incentives for private investment. Individuals were encouraged to bear the burden of settling the frontier region. This is your private investment, and the promise would be, first of all, access to that land, but also that those states that you would be settling would be brought in as an equal state to those that previously existed. That's a big-time public incentive. There also was the incentive to help fund public education by the sale of some of that land. I think it was Block 16. So we see a similar approach used by the federal government in the 1860s with the Homestead Act as we push that frontier, or push into that frontier region even further. And this is not completely unlike the British implementation of mercantilism in the early days, at least, because with the exception of New England colonies that are founded for religious reasons, corporations or joint stock companies like the Virginia Company and individuals like William Penn, who were entrepreneurs, were really out to make a buck, and the British really granted permission for them to do that. And I'm sure they, looking ahead, they knew that these colonies would eventually enrich the parent state, but they left them largely to their own doings. And so, again, will the individual and the group bear this burden? And certainly the public incentive is there. And so, while we can certainly say that American political traditions continue as a good example of continuity, there is a major change, and you can probably sum that up by saying who's in charge. Now, that, of course, is an ideal, and it's also the implementation of the ideal, sort of the practicality side of that. And it's a process that evolves, certainly through the articles into the Constitution, and moving forward, it continues to evolve. Obviously, the response is divided to this shift of sovereignty, and the Anti-Federalists had opposed the Constitution before it was ratified, and it wasn't until a Bill of Rights was promised that they threw their support behind it. We also can see the Virginia and Kentucky resolves and their suggestion of nullification as an example of states asserting their rights in this very early period or the critical period. And later on, we see a more distinct, sectional interest as sectionalism is vocalized in this voice of states' rights and nullification, largely related to tariffs, but also to slavery. And of course, that results in the Civil War, in which the Union victory solidifies or answers the question of who's in charge. That's it for today. Moving forward, I hope to create more topical videos that really do focus on the 4 skills that College Board will be assessing you all on in May. So if you have any questions, please post them below or to the Google or email, or maybe even stop by and see me in class. Take care.